I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd Bashida.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. As we near the end of June, we wanted to humbly ask folks one more time to help spread the word about the podcast by telling family members or friends that you think might like it. The reality is, personal recommendations are the most effective way to convince folks to listen to a new podcast. And the more listeners we get, the more we can help educate and drive action on the climate solutions that we're discussing. Additionally, we are looking to collect personal stories about how the podcast has influenced you. Take a moment and submit a comment on our website. Include your first name, where you're from, and how the podcast has had an impact. And we're planning to feature some of your stories on upcoming episodes. So Todd, we're talking Green New Deal today. What did you know about the topic before we began our research?
Well, I knew of it mainly through probably the political lens. When AOC kind of came to her meteoric rise, I guess you would say, in the political world, and kind of brought the Green New Deal with her, and kind of the controversy that surrounded it. And I basically knew it as a climate deal of some kind and a jobs deal. That I hadn't really delved into a lot of the details of it. I knew some of the overarching goals of it and some of the things we've talked about, on the podcast. But yeah, not tons of detail. How about you?
Yeah, I think similarly. Like I knew that AOC. I guess for those who may not know who AOC is, although I think most folks do, AOC is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a representative from the state of New York, and she, in conjunction with Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts, basically introduced the resolution. And I knew it was climate focused. I knew it was jobs focused. And I knew right away it drew a ton of criticisms from the right side of the political spectrum. But that was, honestly, the crux of it for me.
Yeah.
So before we, really dig in, I've heard you've got a good reason for hope for us this week.
Yeah. So Sevilla, Spain is going to be the first city to start naming heat waves. Heat waves have been dubbed the silent killer. And the city just experienced its worst heat wave in 60 years back in May. And the frequency of heat waves has doubled in Spain compared to previous decades. And going forward, their plan is to name, classify heat waves kind of the same way that we do, hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that. So, which obviously the goal of that is to raise awareness of the deadly impacts of climate change. We know a little bit about heat wave. We should have named heat dome. That was just last summer, was it not? Yeah, about this time a year ago, we had heat dome in Portland, which was really odd. We don't usually experience super hot temps, and we had this weather event where we were, 116 plus degrees here. It was pretty extraordinary. So I concur. I think that would be a good idea. Could have been Heat Dome Jerry or something.
I think it is. It can feel like something that's maybe incremental to talk about this as a reason for hope, but I do think it's important that anytime we can talk about the severity of these events getting worse, whether it's a wildfire or a heat wave, and draw awareness to that and the linkages back to climate change, the more effective we are at building that political will we need to get legislation passed. And yeah, I mean, I don't think the people of the Pacific Northwest are going to forget anytime soon that, that heat dome that we had, for an area that usually doesn't get temperatures much above the 90s in Fahrenheit, having, 4 days or 5 days of over 110 degrees, burning the foliage on plants. I mean, it was pretty apocalyptic.
It was really crazy. And I guess if you're in an area, like Spain is here, where you are going to start the practice of naming them because you have that many of them, it starts to really hit home.
Totally. Yeah. So good for Sevilla, and hopefully other cities follow suit. Well, in starting, today's episode, we thought we would begin with the basic question of, what is the Green New Deal, and equally important, what is it intended to accomplish? And so, in essence, it is a U.S. congressional resolution focused on addressing climate change while trying to tackle a number of other things, predominantly economic inequality, but a whole host of things even beyond that. It was inspired by the New Deal, which was enacted by President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that was really intended to help the United States recover from, what was then the Great Depression. And, we talk about kind of the highlights of it. It draws upon the report that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did back in, this was 2018, where they talked about the importance of keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The resolution also calls out a number of other crises facing, the U.S., reduced life expectancy, access to clean air and water, economic inequality, the stagnating of hourly wages since the 1970s, the racial wealth divide. So a whole host of things beyond, just climate change. And then, given that, calls for massive investments in things like clean energy, updating our grid, electrifying our transportation, cutting emissions in the agricultural sector, and on and on. So really, it sort of lays out climate change and all these other problems facing the nation, and calls for this big investment to try to help address them. Again, I think that the best way to inform yourself is to go and check out the resolution itself and read through it. But yeah, what did you think, Todd? I mean, how would you describe it in a nutshell, knowing that it's such an expansive thing?
Yeah, I guess like you said, it is a fairly easy read. It kind of bullets everything out for you. Of course, each of those bulleted lines is probably like the plans that would go in place to carry any of it out would be massive. It kind of feels more like a movement, in some ways more than a bill, like an entire philosophy change. But it's also a lot of it is really a social programs bill. That was one of the things maybe that was surprising about it, is that there was a lot of social programs in it, and I think that's controversial for some. I think especially it contributes to the size and the cost. Really, it's hard to find a cost.
Yeah.
I think we've struggled trying to find any kind of concrete number, and there's some widely speculative numbers, I think, from the right that I think are a little bit, maybe not a little bit, but a lot exaggerated. um, but I think it's helpful to try to separate that out too, and I think it would be helpful to get good numbers of estimated costs associated with the portions of the bill, so people could really see what they were looking at. But to me, it takes a huge stab at trying to get us where we need to be with the climate. I think some of the emissions goals are right on.
Yeah. And I'm with you. It's like I know they were probably trying to keep it at a high level to not be overly prescriptive about the types of solutions that we need to implement. Like, they wanted to sort of leave that up to debate. But the
Right.
problem in not having more specificity is then the debate then becomes, wildly different in terms of what it will cost and what it will do. It's sort of like you kind of got to get to that next level down of specificity,
Right.
which really kind of leads to the next question, which is, has the Green New Deal been implemented in any way, shape, or form? And the short answer is technically no, because it is just a resolution, and even if it were to pass Congress, it would be non-binding. It would, it's more a statement of goals, if you will. But the real answer is really kind of more complicated, and I think the better question maybe is, how has it had an impact despite the fact that it hasn't become a real piece of legislation? And I don't know, Todd, if you have thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's obvious, even though Biden distanced himself from the Green New Deal, especially when it seemed like he was kind of under attack during some of the campaigning and for the presidency. But obviously, if you look at a lot of what's in his climate plan, it really follows a lot of the same ideas that were in the Green New Deal and kind of follows a lot of that framework. And between Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill, you see a lot of the same stuff in it, even if it's not quite as aggressive as maybe the original Green New Deal was, but you definitely see that influence on his plan. There's some differences. For instance, his plan doesn't offer guarantees on jobs, food, housing, things like that. But it's obvious that there was some influence there. And you seemed like you had found some projects that kind of aligned itself with a lot of the goals of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, so Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a website where they talk about, it's roughly, I think, 60 projects that were funded as of this Earth Day that fit, I don't know if you want to call it the pillars or the aspirations of the Green New Deal: jobs, justice, and decarbonization. There's a whole host of these projects spread across, the U.S. In terms of examples, like there's one in Pleasant Ridge, Michigan, project costs of about $650,000, so still relatively small, where they're doing some water line replacement, with the goal of ensuring safe drinking water. There's another project in Clarkstown, New York, where they're set to implement some water drainage system upgrades, some wetland and stream habitat restoration, and stormwater improvements with the intent of reducing flooding. And again, that one too, I guess, meets sort of the spirit of the Green New Deal. So yeah, even though it remains a resolution that has yet to be passed by the full Congress, it's clear that the idea, to your point about Biden, it's clearly had an impact, right? And even expanded well beyond the borders of the U.S.
Right.
So, talked about what it is, talked about kind of where things stand. I think the next logical question is like, well, what are the kind of the pros and cons? And there are ranging critiques from, its perceived price tag to its large scope to, being kind of dubbed, if not explicitly, implicitly, as sort of government overreach and, attempt to control how we live our lives. And the controversy really started with the initial rollout, where AOC's office published a draft doc with some more controversial ideas, and that got out there into the public sphere. And then, as you can imagine, you had some congressional Republicans that kind of pounced on it and, led for all sorts of fodder on, right-wing news media. Some of the, Republican senators, you had, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who indicated the proposal would confiscate cars and require Americans to ride along a high-speed rail, supposedly powered by unicorn tears. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming warned that ice cream, cheeseburgers, and milkshakes would be a thing of the past because under the Green New Deal, livestock would be banned. And then
Okay.
you had President Trump that referred to it as a, quote, socialist nightmare that would ruin the American economy.
Wow.
Um,
Kind of
yeah,
sounds
so
like a
pretty
bunch of SNL skits or something. Really?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost satirical. The truth is, and you would see this if you go to the resolution, it talks about none of these things. The reality is the Republican criticism should be taken into context for a number of reasons. From my perspective, chief among them is all the fossil fuel money they get. During the 2017-2018 election cycle, Republicans received 87% of the money given by the oil and gas industry and 95% of the money given from the coal industry. So sort of says it all right there, and also explains why, aside from a handful of Republicans who have called for the need to take action on climate, why we haven't seen any substantive bill to address this global crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But putting kind of these partisan critiques aside, what, Tata Shida, do you think are the pros and cons of the Green New Deal?
Well, I think if you look at the New Deal, the historic New Deal, it was basically an economic stimulus package that was comprised of a jobs bill and an infrastructure bill, which this is similar to that, but it also is kind of a social network bill. It also addresses this big problem of climate change. It kind of has a lot in there about livability. So it really does a lot. And you could say that that's good or bad. I was surprised to find how popular bill was. It kind of goes back to the episode we did here recently about perception and how
Right.
depending
Climate
on
perceptions.
and how the media, how where you consume media and stuff, what your perception is. And I think this is one place where, again, what the people want differs from what politicians want or what they think the people should want,
Yeah.
especially with the conservative side of politicians, right? I mean, like you said, they're kind of answering to oil and gas, not their constituency of the people, because some of the numbers I've seen show that there's a 31-point margin of support for the Green New Deal, which was higher, much higher than I thought it was. That number includes, all Democrats, of course, a majority of independents, and over a third of Republicans support the Green New Deal. So I think some of what comes out of Washington is not reflective of what the country really wants.
Does that
And
ever happen?
yeah, right. I think too, I thought that maybe a lot of the extra stuff that's in this bill, other than climate, was hindering the bill. I think if you look at some of the numbers, I think more than 80% of the bill, of the cost, was for social programs that are in the bill. So that
Oh,
doesn't,
wow.
that leaves, that's quite a bit that's not tied to climate. And I know our podcast is about climate. So if you think about the real cost of this thing, if you were to separate some of that out, it would make sense for us that maybe we should separate it out, because we might have a better chance of getting the climate piece done. Republicans, Democrats, the legislators would be more on board to get on, because that's usually the major complaint of these things, right? Is the total cost. But some studies have shown that actually bundling all this stuff together makes people support it more. And
Interesting.
especially amongst like minority voters and some of those folks, that where some of these social programs and the jobs programs could be huge, right? And so those folks really want that stuff in these bills to kind of package all this stuff together. And I also tried to check the cost comparison to what the original New Deal was, and surprisingly, they're pretty close. Obviously, if you look at total numbers, even if you look at inflation, when inflation is calculated, these bills are more expensive than the New Deal was. But our economy is also 20 or 30 times bigger too. So you can't, even with
Right.
inflation added, you can't really make a dollar to dollar comparison. So they do GDP comparisons, and the New Deal was equal to about 2.8% of all goods and services sold in the United States. Some of Obama's bills, which there was the big American Recovery Act during that time. After that
Right.
crash, there was the Affordable Care Act in his term. That combined averaged about 1% of GDP. So the New Deal was a big project, right, in its day. Biden's plan, everything combined, American Rescue Plan and infrastructure bill, is 2.1% GDP. So still not quite as big as the New Deal that Roosevelt had. And if you think about it in those terms, the New Deal was a success, right? I mean, like, we're all here, everything worked out. We used the dams, we used the infrastructure, people got jobs. I think we're looking at a similar thing here. Robert Pollin, an economist at University of Massachusetts, thinks it is doable for us to get to net zero by 2050, spending around 2% of GDP each year, which is about $18 trillion, which is a lot of money. But when you spread it out over time, it's doable. So I think it's on the right track, and I hope people get behind it. What about you? What is your kind of takeaway from what you've read and what you've learned?
Well, I've learned some more things, and just hearing you talk about the public support piece. I think the substantive debate to me is one of, like, scope, and one of
Mm-hmm.
cost, and that question that you talked about, which is, should we be doing climate only, or climate plus all these things, or some other iteration? And I think from a cost perspective, it seems that while the costs are anticipated to be high, it still is really kind of unclear exactly what we're dealing with without specific policy. So a lot of this feels kind of speculative. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think when you're also talking about cost, I think the thing that often gets missed whether we're talking about the Green New Deal or other climate packages, people focus on the price tag. And, the media is guilty of this in missing, but what if we don't do this? What is the cost? Because,
Right.
all of us in our own lives are looking at like, well, yeah, I have to make investments in X, Y, and Z, but what's the, financial impact if I don't make certain investments? And so I think that's critical to making any sort of comparison here, because the reality is climate change is going to cost trillions upon trillions of dollars. And any efforts made to mitigate climate change are still going to be smaller than climate change itself. So
Right.
there is always a good return on investment. So, so that's kind of the cost piece. I think the question of whether all the scope belongs with the bill is really, in my mind, the question should be, well, what's most politically palatable? Like, there's a lot of stuff in the Green New Deal that clearly has huge appeal to your average American. The question is, are there pieces of that that make it less politically viable? And if so, can you set those aside? And I'm not saying I know what any of those are, but
Hmm.
I think that's the critical question to ask is, do we need to really try to do all of this in the same bill, or can a case be made that we, break out certain portions of it to, lower the cost and
Hmm.
increase the political viability?
Right.
Because I think with any piece of at least climate legislation, it's good to be able to look at it from an efficiency perspective. And what I mean is, like, if you're talking about the Green New Deal, or you're talking about a carbon tax, or you're talking about cap and trade, it really ought to be measured in terms of like cost per ton of, CO2 removed or avoided.
Right.
And I don't know how, without more specifics, you measure the efficiency of the Green New Deal. But I do think that, when we're talking about climate policy, that should really be on the table, because, there are people who aren't as concerned about costs, but there are some that are always going to be concerned about costs, and it's good to have their votes. So I guess I'm not offering my own perspective here. I think it
Yeah.
is a positive thing, but I think that there's more questions that need to be answered, before I would sort of say, well, let's move forward with it as it is.
Right. I think it's helpful if you have a cost on if you have a cost of carbon, and then you can kind of quantify what that is going to be, right? And then it helps you to kind of judge some of these actions, right, against carbon removal, right, and prevention in a sense.
Yeah, well, because any good business, whenever they're looking to make a decision, they look at the proposal and then the other alternatives. Government spending usually gets put out there into the media, and people focus on the price tag, but that's just, again, that's just super misleading if you don't talk about what the cost of the status quo is. And I think that's probably the most important piece that we're missing here, is that, yeah, it's going to be expensive to fix, climate change, but it's going to be a whole lot more expensive and miserable and, name your adjective, than, if we don't do something, right?
Right. For
Yeah,
sure.
I'm on my high horse again. What can I say?
That's what we do. That's what we make the big money for.
Big money, huge money
Yeah.
here at Climate Optimists. Well, I think that leads into the question we always ask, which is, really, what can we do? And this week we want to kind of take that in a little bit different direction. So rather than focusing this week's kind of action opportunities on, the Green New Deal, we'd like to step back bigger picture and look at the fact that we have an election coming up in November, and we're almost in July. And it's going to be critical, if we want to continue to make progress on addressing climate change, that we elect the right folks. So our ask is, take the time to find out who, is running for your state and national level offices. Identify the candidates who are most likely to be, call it, climate champions. The League of Conservation Voters is a great source to get a sense of how a candidate, views climate change and the environment more broadly. And then once you've kind of done that, I would encourage everybody to get involved, whether that's financially, donating time to a campaign, or both. Because, we talk about the year 2030 a lot. It's 8 years away. We still need some big legislation to put us on the right trajectory to hit that. And the only way that's going to happen is if we have the right people in office this election cycle. So Not to be dramatic, but I think this, really is the election cycle that's going to make or break our ability to meet those critical climate targets for 2030. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Todd?
I like that. I like that a lot. I am in full agreement.
So, yeah, find out who's running for office, identify the folks that are going to be most likely to help move us forward on climate change, and then get actively involved in supporting them. So I think that's a wrap for this week. Again, we'll have resources on our website where you can learn more about the Green New Deal. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimists Podcast.